feel very pleased and honored to be here in this beautiful room in your company to talk about a rather large subject. I should perhaps introduce myself. You will learn more about myself as we continue this talk, because the subject is very much wrapped up with my life. But briefly, let me just tell you that for the last 30 years, I was a lecturer in Arabic and then professor at SOAS. And before that, I spent 10 years working for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in the Middle East. So the Middle East has been very much my life, but I'm originally from Germany and brought up in Luxembourg. And other things you will hear as we go along. So I sent you the text of the Enneads that I'd like to talk about in particular today. Has anybody had the time to look at it? Yeah, okay, good. There was no need to do so, but I'm glad you did, those who did. And those who did will probably have noticed that we are talking about a subject that is actually beyond words. To do justice to this topic, we should actually be sitting here for the next 3 hours and be silent. But you didn't come for that. So let me pluck up my courage and talk about this topic, nevertheless, as much as I am able to do. Neoplatonism and the Islamic tradition is the title. The type of Islamic tradition that I'm going to talk about is a specific aspect of it, because, of course, Islamic tradition is a huge thing. Islamic tradition today means, first of all, the Quran, then Sufism, and the arts, poetry, and the visual arts in particular. And we will hear more about as we go along. But as far as the presentation is concerned, this is the seminar topics. I will start with a brief introduction to Plotinus and the Neoplatonic tradition, so that we know what is the background that we are going to talk about. Then we have a look at man and the cosmos in the Enneads and the Quran. The Enneads are the principal works of Plotinus. This is to basically make the great framework within which we are going to look at this subject. And then we are going to look at 4 key themes: contemplation, purification, unification, and love. And then finally, there is a conclusion where we will try and see what does all this amount to the extent that we can make a conclusion. Let us begin with Plotinus. He came from Alexandria originally, rather he's an Egyptian. He spent 40 years in Egypt, Alexandria, studying philosophy, and then set out for India to study there, because he had learned about Indian philosophy in Alexandria, even though we don't quite know what he learned of it, but he was sufficiently interested to want to go. But what he studied in Alexandria particularly were the works of Plato and Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, and also, I should say, the Hermetica. These are the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, which is basically the wisdom of ancient Egypt converted into a Greek-type Platonic philosophy. All this he studied and developed his own approach to the Platonic tradition in particular. Well, after he left Alexandria for India, and never got there, he decided finally to settle in Rome, where he lived until the end of his life and composed these writings known as the Enneads. Where are they called the Enneads? Because of a pupil of his called Porphyry, who, after Plotinus' death, edited his writings into 6 books of 9 treatises each. And they are called the Enneads because the Enneads literally mean the niners. 9 treatises per book. And Porphyry was the first of the important pupils of Plotinus who developed what we can call today the Neoplatonic tradition. And here they are, very briefly. There is first of all Porphyry from Tyre. He originally came from Lebanon, and his Arabic name or Lebanese name was Malchus. Then we have Iamblichus from Syria, who was also Arab. He was called Yamliku originally. Hypatia from Alexandria, Proclus from Anatolia, and lastly Damascus from Syria. What is there to be remembered about these for our purpose? The important thing for our purpose is, if you see where they came from, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Anatolia, Syria, they all come from the East. They all come from the same part of the world which saw the birth of Judaism, of Christianity, and of Islam. They come from that particular geographic region, and that is where this reading of Plato, this Eastern reading of Plato, was born. It's a very important point to remember. The second important point about this is that as these philosophers were transmitting their knowledge, Christianity arose and became more and more powerful and became, in the end, the deadly enemy of this very philosophy. One of these philosophers, called Hypatia from Alexandria, she's a woman. She was an outstanding mathematician, a great Neoplatonic philosopher. She was basically brutally assassinated in the streets of Alexandria by a Christian mob. And Damascus, who was the last head of the school of Athens, was forced to leave that school when the Emperor Justinian closed it down. That with Damascus, basically, the old school of Neoplatonic philosophy came to an end. But that didn't mean that Neoplatonism came to an end at all, because the fundamental ideas, the philosophical ideas of that school were found to be extremely relevant to the elaboration of Christian theology. So the church fathers, the founding fathers of Christian theology, read the Neoplatonic writings and said, here, there is something that we can use to elaborate our own faith intellectually. And who were they? There was Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa, both from Cappadocia, again from the east. These are saints today for the church. They are the founding fathers of Christianity. Then there's Evagrius of Anatolia, who was actually living in Egypt and who died there, an extremely important figure in Christian monasticism. Then there is Dionysius the Areopagite. This is the single most important figure in this sequence. The writings of Dionysius are unthinkable without Proclus from Lycia, whom he read. Proclus is unthinkable without Plotinus. Dionysius is the thinker who is the founding father of Christian mysticism in the Greek Orthodox Church and in the Catholic Church. The story of Dionysius is so fascinating, it should be the subject of another seminar here. Then there are two more people I would like to highlight here. There is John Climacus, who was the head of the monastery of Mount Sinai, and who died in 649. The important thing about 649 is he was clearly a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad. And what John Climacus on Mount Sinai did, he wrote a famous treatise called The Ascent of the Soul, which is a fundamental treatise of Christian monasticism dealing with the notion of the ascent of the soul, which we're going to talk about. Then we have another very important figure here, Isaac of Nineveh, an Arab from Eastern Arabia who then lived in Iraq, a fundamental thinker in the Christian Neoplatonic tradition, who is precisely, so he died in AD 700, he is absolutely contemporary with the nascent development of a new, very powerful religion called Islam. So the first thing to remember is Islam arose out of an intellectual, spiritual environment in the Middle East that was deeply marked not only by Judaism and Christianity, as we all know, but also by Neoplatonic philosophy, which had been used by Christian thinkers to elaborate their own faith in intellectual terms. That's a very important thing to take into account. Now, what I would like to turn to is how did Neoplatonic philosophy get into Arabic and into Islam? This is a very interesting story, and there is one part of it which is extremely well known. In the 9th century, let's just say some 300 years after the Prophet, in Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate was established, and those Abbasids were highly interested in the culture, the science, the philosophy of other nations. And there was a translation movement in Baghdad, and Greek texts of every kind Indian texts, Persian texts were translated into Arabic and became the foundation of a new culture, which was at the time really the leading culture in the world. And among these texts were the writings of Plotinus. But the interesting thing is that the name Plotinus never spread into Arabic, because these writings of Plotinus were attributed to Aristotle and to other sages, so nobody knew the name Plotinus at all in Arabic. And the other thing is that these translations were not actually translations, they were actually adaptations of Plotinian thought into Islam. They were Islamic readings of Plotinian philosophy. That's again extremely important. It was not simply taking it over, it was a rereading of Plotinus from an Islamic perspective. And it also did not encompass all the Enneads. Only Enneads 4 to 6 are still available in Arabic. And this translation was undertaken under the stewardship of the first great Muslim philosopher called Al-Kindi, whose thought in turn was greatly influenced by Plotinus. Now, these translations had an enormous impact on Islamic philosophy, Islamic theology, on the Shia, the beliefs of the Shia, and on Sufism. We cannot possibly talk about all the aspects of the influence that these translations had in the Islamic tradition, which is why I will talk about it only from reducing myself to the Quran and to Sufism and the arts, because we have to limit ourselves somehow. Now, you might ask, why the Quran? If these things were translated in the 9th century, the Quran came into being, as we know, in the 7th century, and even before. So why should we talk about the Quran in the first place? Well, as I hope to show, there are certain analogies between Plotinian philosophy and the Quran, which are so remarkable and which are extremely important, because the fact that this closeness exists explains why Plotinian philosophy could have been felt to be so congenial by Islamic thinkers and philosophers and theologians. And we should remember again that the Quran came into being in an environment where Plotinian philosophy, Neoplatonic philosophy, was the leading philosophy of the time. So we are really justified to look at the Quran from that perspective also. Now, I'm not talking here about influence of the Enneads on the Quran, but nevertheless there's something peculiar. There are certain peculiar similarities between the two. About the Quran, one says in Arabic, Al-Qur'anu yufassiru ba'duhu ba'dan. Bits of the Quran explain each other. Why? Because no single topic is discussed only in one surah. All the topics somehow occur throughout. In order to understand any one particular topic in the Quran, you have to read the whole Quran, because it's mutually explanatory. And exactly the same thing applies to the Enneads. There are myriad of topics in the Enneads which are discussed in many of them, and you can't understand any single one without reading the whole lot. And the other strange similarity between them is in actually the form. As we know, the Quran includes surahs that are extremely short, ranging from surahs that are extremely long. The Enneads is exactly the same thing. You have some very long ones, and some that are only a couple of pages. So there's certain odd similarities there. Now, why did I choose to read Ennead 6.9? It happens that one was not actually adapted into Arabic, but all the streams in it are in the Arabic Plotinus texts. But I chose this one in particular because it is a relatively early Ennead. It was written relatively early in Plotinus' writing time, which makes it also one of the more accessible ones, because there are a certain number of Enneads that are really extremely difficult and complex to penetrate. This one is more lucid. It's also a single coherent argument, which is easier to follow, and it has all the key ideas, and it tells one what the philosophy is all about, which is why I chose this one in particular to look at. So this, as far as the general introduction is concerned. Well, let us continue. What I would like to say is, so the question is, what is the argument of this particular Ennead? What is he actually trying to achieve with this? To understand this argument properly, what I think we need to do is to look at the cosmology of Plotinian philosophy. Because without understanding this cosmology, we can't understand what the whole thing is all about. There is something. Their view of the universe is that of a great big pyramid, a great big interconnected pyramid. At the peak of this pyramid is what Plotinus called the One, Tohen, the One, who is a totally incomprehensible, transcendent, ineffable entity, out of whom the whole of the cosmos has emanated in stages. The first stage of emanation is what he called the universal intellect, and this universal intellect is a purely spiritual entity which turns back and looks at the One. As it looks at the One, it is so overwhelmed by what it sees that a kind of creative energy is released, and this creative energy suddenly produces the ideal forms of all that is in existence. But these forms, these ideal forms, are eternal, immutable, and perfect. But out of the creative energy of the universal intellect comes a new emanation called the universal soul. And this universal soul is, so to say, a kind of another explosion of energy which further on creates something new, namely the material world in which we live. And this material world is nothing but a transitory reflection of the ideal forms that exist in the universal intellect. So one extremely important thing to remember when we talk about this philosophy is that this reality that we can touch and see and feel and look at is the least real thing in existence. The reality is simply a mirror image, an inferior and transitory and fallible mirror image of the absolutely perfect forms that exist in the universal intellect. And this particular kind of difference between the material world and the universal intellect, that is something which goes back ultimately to Platonic philosophy. But what makes Neoplatonism or Plotinian thought special is that he has centered his entire philosophy essentially on the concept of the One and on the question of how multiplicity emerges out of the One. That is what makes Plotinus' thought special. Now, the other key thing about the One is that the One is, on the one hand, totally transcendent, ineffable, but on the other hand, it passes on its own essence all the way down the hierarchy, even just in its own oneness, so that even the lowest being, the smallest sand corn and the smallest pebble on the beach is ultimately nothing but an emanation of the One and is a sign for those who know that the One exists. So that One is on the one hand totally transcendent and beyond our understanding. On the other hand, that One is immanent and tangible in all that exists. How can these two things be true at the same time? Logically, they cannot. But the whole point about this philosophy is that it is a non-dualist philosophy. It is a philosophy that centers upon the fact that contradictions are simultaneously true. And that is the thing that it has in common with Indian philosophy, the Indian so-called Advaita Vedanta philosophy, which is equally non-dualist. And that's where the link with Plotinus is often thought. So I've given you a handout with some extracts, and if you read text 1.1, the very first one on the first page, you will see that how he describes the One and the total transcendence of the One. Would anybody like to read that little paragraph?
I'll read it.
Yes, please.
Transcendence.
Tanzih, that's the Arabic term, yes.
Generative of all, the unity is none of all. Neither thing, nor quantity, nor quality, nor intellect, nor soul, not in motion, not at rest, not in place, not in time. It is the self-defined, unique in form, or better, formless, existing before form was, or movement, or rest, all of which are attachments of being and make being the manifold it is.
Thank you very much. So you see here, this one is above being. Therefore, Plotinus, and being always is attached to some kind of quality. But this one is beyond all qualities. It's actually really beyond anything imaginable. That is what the one is for Plotinus. But on the other hand, that one is also immanent. And could anybody read, please, the text 1:2? Anybody would like to read 1:2?
I'll read it.
Yes, please.
Not read it before, but immanence as sign, image. Things here are signs.
That's the Greek term, mimemata, signs. Yeah.
They show, therefore, to the wiser teachers how the Supreme God is known. The instructed priest, reading the sign, may enter the holy place and make real division of the inaccessible.
Yeah. Key word here is that things here are signs. Everything in existence, as I said, even the smallest pebble on the beach, if you look at it with understanding, with, as the Quran would say, the eyes of the heart, you realize it is a sign. It means itself, and it means something other than itself. And this significatory power is in fact the power of the one, and becomes manifest at the most elementary level in the simple fact that this object you're looking at, you can identify it as one. Because the oneness of anything, the oneness of a chair, of a bottle, of a stone, of whatever else, is a quality which is simply an image of that ultimate oneness which is beyond all our imagination. So this one, the oneness of anything in existence, is merely borrowed from that unimaginable entity which is the perfect and absolute one, which we cannot possibly imagine. Why can't we imagine the one? A human brain cannot imagine the one because we can only imagine one in opposition to something else. If we think of something that is one, we can immediately see their boundaries. There's one thing, and then there's something which is not the one. But the thing that Plotinus is talking about is something that has no boundaries whatsoever. And we are incapable of perceiving, comprehending something that has no boundaries of any kind. But it's out of this boundlessness that anything in existence borrows its own being. Because without oneness, nothing has any kind of coherence or existence. Oneness is the most basic condition for anything to even be. This is how Plotinus starts this particular Ennead. Now, when we come to...
Somebody has a question.
Yes, please.
Can I ask a question?
Yes?
I don't know, it's just a thought, but would he then have a word or anything that then described the human ability in whatever way to even perceive or be able to be in the presence of the one? So we understand that the mind cannot comprehend it, but still he's talking about it.
This is extremely, very, thank you so much. This is an extremely important question. What in us enables us to even perceive the one in the first place? If the rational mind cannot comprehend it, if it's beyond reason, what, according to this philosophy, enables us to do this is that we have a soul. And that soul is ultimately an emanation of the one. So we carry within us, within our soul, a spark, so to say, of that ultimate reality. And if we rediscover that spark in ourselves, then we are suddenly closer to understanding what it's all about. And discovering the spark for this, Neoplatonic philosophy uses the image of the polishing of the mirror. The soul is like a mirror. In our normal lives, this mirror is rusty. It doesn't reflect anything. But if we polish it, and we'll talk about that later under Purification, then suddenly that mirror reflects where it originally came from. And we suddenly come to understanding or to come to comprehension of that oneness. But your question was extremely important. And we now, in actual fact, are going to talk about the soul, because here I spoke about the universal soul. The universal soul, from a modern perspective, is something like what Jung called the collective unconscious. It's a sort of universe, it's a collective soulness that we all share. But we also have each one of us also has an individual soul. And now, where does this individual soul stand? It stands halfway between the one who is the source of all beauty, goodness, and love, on the one hand, and the material world on the other. And that material world is nothing but a transitory reflection of these great ideals. And the soul has a choice. It can remember where it came from, it can polish the mirror, as I just said, and thereby return up to the one, or it can forget where it came from, dissipate itself in material goods and enjoyments and distractions, and sink down into the material world and lose itself, and lose everything that it could be living for. So this is the choice. This is where the soul stands. And if we now look from this perspective to the Ennead that I've given you, I'll briefly summarize the argument of it before we enter into more detail. The argument is basically, in a nutshell, is as follows. He starts by saying, all existence derives from the one. The first sentence of the Ennead is, it is in the virtue of unity that beings are beings. Without that unity, nothing is a being. And then he asks the question, well, where is that unity actually from? Where can we find it? And as he continues his argument, he realizes that all existence have a unity, but that unity they only borrow. They participate in it. They are not it. Then he asks, is the universal soul then the unity? Is universal intellect the unity? He says, no. All these, universal soul and universal intellect, are all still multiplicities. They are not the unity. They borrow the unity from somewhere else. And if we ask ourselves, where is this unity? He realizes this comes from a place which we cannot even name. And all that we can do in our lives is to purify ourselves in order to seek the unification of our soul with that ultimate unity. And that is the purpose of our existence. And this leads me to Plotinus' last words. The last words he spoke before he died. He told one of his pupils, strive to bring back the divine in yourself to the divine in the all. This is what basically this whole philosophy is all about. But having given that kind of general introduction, the question now is, concretely speaking, how does all this relate to Islam? What are the parallels? And here we come to the Quran. I've given you this outline of the cosmology of Neoplatonism. And if we look at the cosmology that the Quran represents, we see that there are certain fundamental similarities. There is, first of all, the notion of the one. Now, the key criterion of divinity in the Quran and in Islam as such is the unity of God, Al-Ahad. That's absolutely fundamental. That is one point they absolutely have in common. Then there is the transcendence of God. That God is totally transcendent. That also is upheld in the Quran. The famous phrase, no thing is like him, laysa kamithlihi shay. God is not like anything at all, is beyond all thingness, beyond all being. Then we have the world of the intellect, universal intellect, which is this world of ideal forms. In the Quran we have al-akhirah, which is the hereafter, which is again a world of ideal forms. If we go down to the world of matter, the counterpart of the world of matter in the Quran is ad-dunya. Ad-dunya is this world, and this world in the Quran is transitory, it is unreal, it is deceptive, it is nothing but like in Neoplatonism, nothing but a transitory copy of the world of perfection, which is in Al-Akhirah. Then we have the notion of immanence. In the Quran, one of the key terms in the Quran is the word ayah. Ayah means sign. And this ayah has two significations. On the one hand, it means sign in the sense that anything in existence is a sign that the Creator exists and has given it life. And the other meaning of ayah is verse of the Quran. So from an Islamic perspective, the whole world is composed of two books. The Quran, full of signs, and the whole of the cosmos, also full of signs. And our task is to read these signs in order to understand where we came from. So there are some basic structural similarities there. And when it comes to the question of the soul, it's striking how the notion of memory and remembrance is of equal importance in Neoplatonism and Islam. The notion of dhikr, of remembering, or remembrance is the key to Sufism. And it's just as important as in Neoplatonism. Purification, the same term exists. We'll talk more about purification later. The notion of return, the same thing. And in exactly the same way, the notion of forgetting is as important in the Quran as in Plotinus. And the notion of the soul forgetting and commanding evil and taking us down to the lower regions is exactly the same thing. So are they really so similar? The structural similarity exists, but there are certain key differences, which is certainly very important to mention as well. The most important difference is that for Plotinus, the one is beyond any comprehension, and the one therefore does not think, because thinking involves subject and object. There is no subject and object in the one. The one does not want anything. There's no will, because if you have will, that's to say you are there and there is another object there that you want. That doesn't exist in the one. The one is completely self-sufficient. There's no will in the one. No thinking and no will. And also the one doesn't know, because if you know anything as an object, you are no longer one if you know something. The one is beyond knowledge. That, of course, is very different from the Quranic concept of God, because according to the Quran, God knows, and God wants, and God acts, and so on and so on. This is completely non-Enneadic. What the Quranic God really is, if you look at it from a Platonic perspective, is a combination of the Plotinian one with the universal intellect. Because the universal intellect for Plotinus is that is the thing that thinks, that wants, that has the creative energy. That is where the two coalesce. And here we again have a couple of texts to read. Anybody would like to read passage 1.5? Yes, please.
Attributes,
Sifat in Arabic, yes.
The one does not know, does not have will, does not move. No Arab equivalent.
Yeah, that's the one. That's me, right? And now we come to Plotinus here.
Neither can it have will to anything. It is a beyond good, not even to itself a good, but to such beings only as may be of quality to have part with it. Nor has it intellection that would comport diversity, nor movement. It is prior to movement as to intellection. To what could its intellection be directed? To itself? But that would imply previous ignorance. It would be dependent upon that intellection in order to have knowledge of itself. But it is the self-sufficing. Yet this absence of self-knowing does not comport ignorance. Ignorance is of something outside, a knower ignorant of a knowable, but in the solitary there is neither knowing nor anything unknown.
Thank you very much. This is pure Plotinus and pure non-dualism. There is neither knowing nor anything unknown. It's a complete contradiction, but the whole point is that this total contradiction is actually simultaneously happening. That's the heart of the matter. And that, of course, this particular argument, you cannot square that with the Quran as such, because in the Quran, of course, God is knowing and God is creating. But the interesting thing is there's nevertheless a certain point of similarity, which is quite remarkable and quite important. And that concerns the creative charge. In the Quran, when God wants something, he says kun, he says be. So the creative charge of God is actually a word. It's the word be, and the moment that word is uttered, something happens. Now the really interesting thing is that in the Enneads, that creative charge is actually called also word. It's called logos spermatikos. It is the seminal word. And this seminal word, how does the seminal word come into being? For Plotinus, it's not a God who says be, but it is the universal intellect that looks at the one and is so overwhelmed by the beauty and power of the one that so spontaneously this creative word emanates out of it and brings the soul into being. And the same thing happens with the universal soul. It looks up, and out of it emanates that out of contemplating ultimate perfection, suddenly creativity arises. And underlying this entire idea is that if we look at beauty, at absolute beauty, if we look at anything that is really that is perfection in any way, it seizes us in such a way that we don't remain static. It gives us energy, and energy arises out of the contemplation of perfection. And that energy, for Plotinus, is the seminal word. So, in both Plotinus and in the Quran, there is this notion of creative energy crystallizing in the form of a word, of logos or kalima. That's an interesting kind of observation. So, we spoke about the correct parallel. Let us look now at the soul from the point of view of Islam and Plotinus. The soul, as I said, stands in between these two levels, in between a path leading up towards the one and a path leading downwards into material multitudinousness. Why does the soul want to go, naturally want to aspire to go upwards? Because here, let's see what Enneads says. From God it comes, its good lies there, and once turned to God again, it is what it was. We came from there, and we want to go back to there. Now, this key idea is absolutely, literally expressed in the Quran in exactly the same way. To God we belong, and to Him we shall return. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi laraji'un. Literally the same idea. Question is, what does it mean we belong to God? Here we come to the question of the interpretation of the Quran. From the Plotinian perspective, when he says, from God it comes, that means that the soul has pre-existence. Our soul existed before we were born. It's very, very ancient. Is there a pre-existence of the soul in Islam? That is precisely one of these questions which lead to debate and disagreement. According to some, there is no pre-existence. The soul came into existence once we were born. But on the other hand, from the Sufi perspective, there is pre-existence. And that pre-existence of the soul goes back to the very beginning of time, when all the souls were assembled before God, and God said to the souls, am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum in Arabic. And they all said, Bala, we are. And this allegiance, original allegiance to God, that is why We belong there and ultimately want to go back there. But this particular interpretation of that Quranic verse, to interpret this particular encounter between the souls and God from a Neoplatonic perspective, that is, you see, an aspect of what happened later on when Islamic thinkers looked at the Quran and discovered elements of it that were similar to this Neoplatonic creed, and then really reinterpreted the Quran lock, stock, and barrel from a Neoplatonic perspective. And that interpretation was then rejected by others who felt that this was completely wrong and outlandish. So the Sufi interpretation of the Quran is disputed by traditional orthodoxy. I mean, the whole question of how to interpret the Quran is an enormous and extremely complicated issue. But now we come to the key question that I was really coming to in my entire talk. We want to go back to God. We want to return to God. How do we do this? What does that mean in practice? And here, that is where I would like to look at the two answers from the Neoplatonic perspective, from the Islamic perspective. What is the similarity? So how do we go back? Any suggestions?
Prayer.
Prayer, yes.
Remembrance.
Remembrance, yes. What else? How do we go back? How do we find the way back?
We have to die in this world and go to the next world.
At the end of the day, that's the moment. That is finally the moment. But the whole question is, can we get there earlier?
Well, there's death to the ego, isn't there, like the nafs? I mean,
The death of the ego.
Maybe the gentleman meant a death.
Well, exactly. If you look at it from the death of the ego, that's absolutely right. Absolutely. No doubt about that, yes.
Self-discovering process, knowing ourselves.
Yeah. Definitely. And we'll come across this very quote in a little while. So, well, look, I mean, I think you're all going in the right direction. The way that I've divided up this topic is into 4 different ones. The path to return, contemplation, purification, unification, and love. And in what you've said, all these points are really part of that. Well, let's embark on the first of these, contemplation. What, in fact, are we supposed to contemplate? I said that everything is a sign. So the first thing is to learn how to look at the whole of the cosmos as signs, to read the signs. That is the very beginning, the contemplation of the signs. Now, what are these signs? If you look again more closely, the Enneads say, as we read, things here are signs. They show to the wise teachers how the Supreme God is known. We've read that earlier. We also took note in the Quran, there are signs in that for people of understanding. These are the Quranic verses. But then there also is the other things, when the signs of the merciful are read to them, they fall and prostrate. These are the signs of the Quranic verses. So, signs. This is, of course, an enormous chapter. As I said, everything is a sign. So what are we going to complete? What I'm going to look at, in particular, is geometry. The point and the circle, these are, Plotinus says, they are symbols of a higher concept. How come that geometry can be a sign? Well, the important thing is here. Now, this is a translation from the Arabic Plotinus. That particular passage deals with what is in the world of intellect. I said earlier, the world of intellect is a world of perfection. The material world is simply a copy of, an imperfect copy of that perfection. So Plotinus is asking what actually is in the world of the intellect. And if we look at the arts, are they in the world of intellect? So he says the arts are in the intellectual world, for they achieve the beauty of symmetry. The beauty of symmetry, that is something which is part of this intellectual realm, of this eternal intellectual realm. From the dominion that springs from there, the beauty of symmetry is actually of divine origin. the term for this is husn al-i'tidal. The philosopher Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote about the meaning of this i'tidal. What is special about i'tidal? For him, what is special about it is that anything that has i'tidal is brought into a unity. Because symmetry ultimately means that two things are put together in such a way that they are in equilibrium. So what i'tidal really means, it's a sign pointing to the unity of the Creator from where we come. And this power of geometry to generate symmetry, that is what gives it a special status and makes it a science which is halfway between this material world and the world of the eternity. And then Plotinus continues both in Arabic and in Greek. As for the art of geometry, since it is intellectual, in that sense it is indubitably there. The art of geometry is indubitably in the intellectual realm, no question about it. So it has an enormously high status. But how this is to be understood becomes clearer if we read point 4.1. If somebody could please read point 4.1, please.
Point and circle, nukta and daira.
Thank you.
We are not to think of such unity and partlessness as belong to point or monad. The veritable unity is the source of all such quantity which could not exist unless first there existed being and beings prior. We are not then to think in the order of point and monad, but to use these in their rejection of magnitude and partition as symbols for the higher concept.
The key word here is symbols for the higher concept. This is what I mean earlier when I spoke about science. The Greek word here is analogias, analogies. The whole Platonian thinking is suffused with analogy. Anything that we can grasp in our minds is ultimately nothing but an analogy of another reality which is higher, which is eternal, which comes from another world altogether. So these geometric entities like point and circle, they are not in themselves the thing that we're talking about. They are simply signs, analogies. But being analogies, they are nevertheless extremely powerful means to express what we're trying to say. Now, the interesting thing from the Islamic perspective is that at the very time when Greek philosophy was translated into Arabic, including Platonian texts, there arose in Baghdad a new kind of artistic style called the Samara style, which is fundamentally geometrical and which is the ancestor of the geometric styles called the Jiri mode, which ultimately became prevalent throughout the Islamic world, all the way from India to Andalusia. But the beginnings of this particular artistic movement can be traced back to 9th century Baghdad, to the same period when these thoughts about the significance of geometry, about the philosophical or ontological significance of geometry first came into being. And here is an example of the Samara style, and the early geometric style. Here is another one. Now, the other thing that came into being at that point, and that's something I'd like to talk a little bit more about, is a theory about the Arabic script, the so-called proportion script. Because the script, of course, was the means to make the divine word visible or readable. So the idea was how to design a script that is in keeping with the divinity of the message. And the only way to design such a script was to base it upon geometrical rules. And it starts with the circle and the square. And here you have the first letter of the Arabic alphabet, which is the alif. And the alif is to be understood as the diameter of a circle. And this circle with diameter alif and the square with equal to side of alif, these figures are the origin out of which all the Arabic letter shapes are made. But in actual fact, they are not the sole origin. The real origin of it is actually what you see here, the dot. These dots. This aleph that you see here is composed of exactly 7 dots. The aleph ultimately comes out of the dot. The dot is the thing that generates the aleph, and the aleph in turn generates all the other letters. And to show you a concrete example of this, which brings us to Ibn Arabi, here you have the letter Nun. Now the letter Nun, according to Arabic, upon the theory of the proportion script, is exactly a semicircle. Now, when Ibn Arabi writes about Nun, he says this semicircle of Nun is a symbol of something. This is the visible world, and the other half of the semicircle, which you can't see, is the invisible world. The world is made up of alam al-shahada wa alam al-ghaib. That is, so the Nun itself is a pointer. And now in Arabic, the Nun has a dot, and this dot is in the middle. And the dot, of course, is the symbol of oneness. So for Ibn Arabi, the letter Nun, the way it was shaped, with the dot in the middle, is actually a cosmic symbol. And now there is a Quran, and in the Quran there is a verse that starts with the letter Nun. Nun wal qalami ma yasturun. Nun, the name of the letter, and by the pen and that which they write. For Ibn Arabi, that Nun in the Quran is actually this. And this is nothing but an allegory, in Platinian sense, an allegory of the cosmos. So you can see how geometry and the script are combined to become allegorical images of creation. And then there arose out of this, as I said, a whole theory of calligraphy, which is fundamental for the entire Islamic and Arabic calligraphic tradition. And I had the great fortune to spend several years working with the great Egyptian artist Ahmed Mustafa to actually make a detailed analysis of the geometrical rules of the proportion script. And we called the book The Cosmic Script. The subtitle is Sacred Geometry and the Science of Arabic Penmanship. And here, what you see here, this is from an Arabic manuscript, and you see the letter shapes based upon the geometrical grids that they came from. And here you see a flute. And the reason why this flute was put there is because what the theoreticians of calligraphy were saying is that calligraphy is visual music. The laws of music, the laws of harmony, and the laws of geometry are images of each other. And by making the script work in accordance with the laws of geometry, we are harmonizing the script as though we were making music in musical harmonies. These things are connected. And here you can see how this Neoplatonic stroke Islamic heritage has an enormous bearing on the arts. Because, of course, calligraphy is the fundamental art form of Islamic tradition. And the theory of it arises out of that ancient tradition that I've been talking about. And when it comes to, I said earlier I was going to say something about my life. When I first started working at SOAS, dealing with Arabic, I really, to be honest with you, knew virtually nothing about Plotinus. It was just a name to me. I hardly knew there was a difference between Plotinus and Plato. But all this changed when I spent years with Ahmed researching this book. And that's when I came across the Arabic Plotinus adaptations, these texts. And I started realizing the enormous importance of this heritage, and I spent a long time reading up about it. And my next question that I asked myself, well, if Plotinus, if this heritage is so important for the visual arts, does it also have a bearing for the one subject that was my subject originally, namely poetry? And that leads to something else, which I'll talk about later. But basically, that's how it is through the arts and through calligraphy that I first became interested in that particular topic. We are still with geometry. We spoke about geometry from the point of view of art and calligraphy. Now I'll talk about geometry from the point of view of theory. As I said, geometry is a sign. What does that mean in practice? Can I ask somebody to read text number 4.2, please?
Every soul that knows its history is aware also that its movement, unthwarted, is not that of an outgoing line. Its natural course may be likened to that in which a circle turns not upon some external, but on its own centre, the point to which it owes its rise. Is then this centre of our souls the principle for which we are seeking? We must look yet further. We must admit a principle in which all these centres coincide. It will be a centre by analogy with the centre of the circle we know. The soul is not a circle in the sense of the geometric figure, but in that it at once contains the primal nature as centre, and is contained by as circumference. That it owes its origin to such a centre, and still more that to the soul, uncontaminated, is a self-contained entity. In our present state, part of our being weighed down by the body, as one might have the feet under the water with all the rest untouched, we bear ourselves aloft by that intact part, and in that hold through our own centre to the centre of all the centres, just as the centres of the great circles of a sphere coincide with that of the sphere to which all belong. Thus we are secure.
Thank you for reading this pretty complicated text. What on earth does all this mean? This is, typical Plotinus. To put it in a nutshell, he is saying that we are both the center of a circle and we are a circumference. What does this mean in practice? Well, we can look at it more closely by turning to Ibn Arabi and to another explanation of Plotinus, where he talks about the same thing in a way that is perhaps more easy to follow. Plotinus says, what the center is like is revealed through the radial lines. It is as if it was spread out without being spread out. So the center is revealed through the radial lines, and the center is as though it was spread out without being spread out. So the center is, on the one hand, a center, but on the other hand, it is also manifest on the periphery through these radial lines. How does Ibn Arabi speak about this? He says, in the circle, manyness has become manifest from the one in entity, without the one becoming many in its essence. This is really a clearer explanation of what it's all about. So here, Ibn Arabi is crystal clear. In the circle, manyness has become manifest from the one in entity, which is the dot, the circle, the center circle, without the one becoming many in its essence. And you can see here what he's really saying is that this circle, in all its extension, would not exist if it wasn't for the one in the middle. The one in the middle determines that line. So the one has become many through the circle, but in itself it's still one. So this is what Ibn Arabi is explaining, the relationship between unity and multiplicity through the image of the circle. The one stays one in the center, but yet it becomes many through the impact it has on the circle. That's really what also Plotinus is saying. Ibn Arabi is explaining it here in a clearer way, I think. But the opposite of that is the many within the one. Enneads, Plotinus says, he is outside the encompassment of all things. God is outside encompassing everything. And in the Futuhat, Ibn Arabi says, he encompasses everything, and there he quotes the Quran, just as a circle's circumference preserves the center point's existence. The Quranic phrase, إِنَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ مُحِيطٍ. He encompasses everything in Arabic. And in Arabic also from the Quran, فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. So this is the point of this. On the one hand, God is encompassing everything and we are in the middle. On the other hand, we are here and wherever you look, there is God. So you can see how this image of the center and the circle expresses two completely opposite things. They're opposite of each other. But in essence, the message is the same. And this simultaneous existence of opposites is an absolutely key example of this non-dualist thinking, the Advaita thinking that Plotinus has, that Ibn Arabi has, that Indian philosophy also has. It comes out in a very simply crystallized form in this image. And as you can see, what Ibn Arabi says about it and what Plotinus says about it is really virtually the same thing, in other words. And that brings us to the end of this particular section. I was speaking about contemplation here. How does contemplation help us in our pathway? I've illustrated this by looking at geometry as a sign. What does this mean? What's the purpose? The purpose of this type of contemplation is, first of all, to orient ourselves, to make it clear to us where we actually are and what direction we are going. And as Plotinus says, if you go linearly in one direction, you'll go nowhere. The only real direction that you go is in a circle around the center. The funny thing is, in modern words, when we speak about turning around in circles or going in circles, it means it's nothing, you're lost. For Plotinus, it's the exact opposite. If you go in one direction straight on, you are going to be lost, you will get nowhere. The point is, your soul must circle around the thing that matters, which is inside you, in your own self, you see. And then I've also pointed out that this has direct practical implications where in the arts. We've spoken about calligraphy, about artistic practice. That's the practical counterpart of these theoretical elaborations exists there. The two go hand in hand. And all this arises out of that source that I've been talking about. Now we come to the second one of these four methods on our pathway, and that is called purification. And it is an issue that is discussed at length in Neoplatonism and in Islam and also in Christianity. It's a very, very important topic, the purification of the soul. We could spend weeks talking about this. And I should say that earlier I said that working with Ahmed has been a reason why I started working on Neoplatonism. My late wife is a second reason, because my late wife, she was studying Sufism, in particular Ibn al-Muhasibi, whom we're going to hear about in a moment. And al-Muhasibi wrote a great deal about the purification of the soul. And one day my wife said to me, I would like to write a paper comparing al-Muhasibi's idea on the purification of the soul and the texts of the cantatas by Bach. I said, what on earth are you talking about? It seemed to be most peculiar. And then I started looking at the text of these cantatas. And lo and behold, the purification of the soul is so much there, like in Muhasibi. So I asked myself, where on earth, if you trace them back, where do you get to? Through Bach, you get to medieval mysticism, you get to Meister Eckhart. Through Meister Eckhart, you ultimately get to Plotinus. With Muhasibi, of course, it's the same thing. You get to the same. There's a common font where all this comes from. So this is another reason that brought me to Plotinus. But speaking more specifically about purification, what does Plotinus say about it? That is so good in Elaroui. In the circle, manyness has become manifest from the one in entity, without the one becoming many in its essence. Brilliant stuff. Okay? So, we come to purifying the soul. Plotinus says, in our self-seeing there meaning as we approach the one, in those higher spheres of the universal intellect, in our self-seeing there we are merged into that self in us, which has the quality of that order. It is a knowing of the self restored to its purity. What does he mean when he says we are merged into that self in us, which has the quality of that order? Why does our self or soul have the quality of that order. It has that quality because that is where originally it came from. So knowing the self restored to its purity means knowing the self in the condition when it first arose, in its original condition, as, so to say, a spark of the one. So purification means to bring the soul back to its original pure condition. That's what it's all about. And then Plotinus, in another Ennead, he says, to have been purified is to have cleansed away everything alien. Everything alien is all otherness. Everything that interferes between you and your own origin, all this goes, and here we come, of course, to the famous image of the polishing of the mirror. It's all about polishing the mirror. That's the image for all this. Now, if we look at purification in the Quran, it's an extremely important concept in the Quran, purification. And the key statement is whoever purifies it, namely the soul, will prosper. Man aflaha, man zakaha, man aflaha zakaha. Aflaha. Zakaha is the word that the Quran uses for purification, or tazkiyah is the noun for it. And purifying it to what? Again, the Quran is not a theoretical book. It does not theorize about this issue like Plotinus does. But what the Quran brings into the picture is the notion of the fitra. And the fitra is that original condition, that primordial disposition, that is the one with which we were brought into being in the first place. It's this notion again of the soul restored to its purity. It's that moment when the souls were, to say, assembled before the Creator, and the Creator said, "Am I not your Lord?" That is the fitra. That is this original thing. Again, the Quran doesn't actually literally say that, but this is the word. This is the way the word fitra is explained later on by exegetes who are familiar with this Neoplatonic tradition. Now, concretely speaking, I'd like to give you two examples how this purification functions in Islam. There's been so much written about it. Just two examples. Pathways to purification. There is, on the one hand, al-muhasibi, the person I just mentioned. Hasaba in Arabic means to take oneself to task. And this man wrote several books on self-examination and purification. They became so successful that he himself was called al-muhasibi, the self-examiner, so to say. And for al-muhasibi, pathways to purification are religious observance. Fundamentally, the most important thing is to observe the religious traditions, the prayer, the almsgiving, the pilgrimage. All these things have to be observed, but it is not enough to simply observe them like automatically, mechanically. They have to be observed fully with deep intention. And the whole work on muhasibi was to really explore what does your real intention involve. If you really do these ritual works sincerely, deeply, honestly, so that they have meaning, what does that mean in practice? And I'm summarizing here very briefly what muhasibi says. There are three steps. There's first of all self-examination, muhasaba, asking yourself, am I really being honest doing this? Secondly, there is tathhir in Arabic, which he says, stripping away what has to be done away with. Anything that is not part of what you should be doing now has to go. And lastly, there is tasfiyah, which literally means purification, cleansing that which remains. So self-examination, stripping everything unessential away, and lastly, looking at that which remains and purifying it further, tasfiyah. It's then, if you perform your ritual acts with this, then they are real. Otherwise, they are meaningless. So for muhasibi, that was the pathway, and his entire examination, his entire vocabulary, everything he writes about is based upon Quran and Sunnah. There is not an ounce of philosophy, of Greek philosophy in muhasibi. It comes entirely out of the Islamic tradition. But as you've seen, the Quran itself is, of course, part of this wider tradition. He's part of it through the Quran. The other example, yes, please.
Sorry, just one quick question. When he says that you look at that which remains and purify it further, how do you purify it further when you've already gone through those other things?
You have to read Al-Muhasibi. he will write pages on this. He is Al-Muhasibi has the deepest knowledge of the human soul with all its failings. He is deeply aware how we can constantly deceive ourselves and think we are doing the right thing when we are really doing it for a completely different motive. And Muhasibi is a master of that. So that's where tasfiyah comes into it. You know. Now the other way, pathway to purification, is the philosopher. Al-Kindi was the philosopher who supervised the translation of Plotinus' or the adaptation of Plotinus' writings. And he also writes about purification. But for him, the point of purification is not to perform the ritual acts of religion. Al-Kindi wouldn't say don't do it, he said fine, you do it, but really what for him was important is philosophical integrity, to live a life of philosophical integrity, of honesty in keeping with your beliefs. And you do that how? By studying wisdom and virtue, hikmah, which means, in fact, the philosophical texts. Then by tatahhur, which is from the same word as tathhir for Muhasibi, but tatahhur for Al-Kindi, it is purificatory abstinence, you would call it. You know, living a life of abstinence, not getting involved in material goodness, in war, in power, in money. All these things are secondary. None of that. And lastly, the image that Al-Kindi uses is polishing the mirror, which in Arabic is siqal, the polishing of the mirror. Polishing the mirror of the soul, he uses for that the Plotinian term. Yeah. So we have here two different pathways that I've outlined for the sake of simplification. The philosophical one, the ritual one, but they didn't say separate. They were combined. And one of the great thinkers who combined them creatively was Al-Ghazali, basically brought these two points of view, into one coherent philosophy of Sufism, for which he became famous. That brings us to purification. Now, and of course, yes, I mean, when it comes to Sufism purification, I forgot to mention what I said already earlier, that in the Sufi context, the key, the center of this process of purification resides in remembrance. In the act of remembrance, as expressed in the concept of dhikr. The dhikr actually really is nothing other than a polishing of the mirror, if it is done in the proper way. That's what it's all about. Now, the next stage that I would like to talk to is really, in a sense, the highest, and that is the actual unification. It's the point of return. Once you have contemplated creation, you have engaged in purification, you are stepping towards this highest goal, which is this goal of unification. And there again, there are parallels. Plotinus describes, as you have seen in the Enneads, describes this in extremely poetic language, extremely suggestive language. He, that's to say, the adept, has become the unity. No movement now, no passion, no outlooking desire, once this ascent is achieved. Filled with God, utterly resting, he has become very rest. And this term, the rest, the Greek term for this is hesychia. And I don't know if anybody of you have heard of hesychasm. Hesychasm, that is the term for the mysticism of the Greek Orthodox Church. Comes from hesychia, from tranquility. That is the attempt to achieve that state of tranquility when the soul basically rests in the realization of its own origin. Now, the Greek, the Orthodox Church, of course, has engaged in meditative practices which are the equivalent of the Sufi dhikr, the repetition, endless repetition of certain particular holy phrases with concentration, a life of prayer, of abstinence. But all this ultimately is there to attain to that particular ideal of Hezekiah, of total tranquility. In Ibn Arabi, of course, this state is talked about a great deal. In fact, essentially all Sufi writing revolves around the question of this particular concept, which is a concept that ultimately cannot be expressed in words. Ibn Arabi says here, he is the universe of oneness. In complete annihilation, he has neither observation, nor witnessing, nor gnosis. The term annihilation in Arabic is fana. I think being in the Beshara society, you will have heard the term fana before. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a little while. Question is, where does this exist in the Quran? The Quran, again, is not a work of theory. It doesn't have any kind of theoretical explanation of this concept of unification, but there is an extremely important phrase which has been used again by interpreters as a pointer to that condition. It's that phrase, O soul at peace, return to your Lord, pleased and well-pleasing. أيها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية. And that was taken and is taken from the Sufi perspective as an expression of that particular ultimate return of the soul to God. And here again you have this notion of tranquility, in Arabic tama'nina or sakina. The tama'nina or the sakina in Arabic is the exact equivalent of the Greek Hezekiah. We are talking really ultimately about precisely the same concept, precisely the same ideal. And I think one of the tragedies of history is that the Greek Orthodox mystic tradition and the Islamic mystic tradition grew side by side for centuries, and not many of their adepts understood in the least that the other side was talking actually the same language. There were some cross currents, but there could have been a lot more. To complete this unification aspect by looking at the notion of fana in Arabic. Now, this notion of fana, what does unification actually mean, has resulted in a vast Arabic literature, Sufi literature, not only in Arabic but also in Persian, and in which this concept is really, really analyzed to extraordinary lengths and with the highest degree of sophistication. What I'm presenting here is an extremely simple summary. The first point to know is that there is not only annihilation, there's also subsistence. The two terms, annihilation and subsistence, are mirrors of each other. There's fana and there's also baqa in Arabic. Something goes and something else remains. And it goes in steps. The first thing that is annihilated is all transgression. Everything, transgression in the sense of sin, in the sense of wickedness, that's the first thing that disappears. And what remains when transgression disappears is righteousness. So the basis of everything is that you are behaving as a good human being with others. There's no path to unification with God if you are a ruffian, if you're a criminal, if you beat your wife, you name it, forget about all that. It starts right at the beginning, in the way in which you behave in your ordinary everyday life. The second step of fana is all earthly desire. Money, power, all that connects with it is totally secondary. All material things, material gains is absolutely unimportant. What remains is contentment. And that's where you have the Arabic term, the nafsun radiyatun mardiya. The nafsun radiya is a soul that is content. Content why? Because all these material things you don't need. They are not part of what gives you your entity. So contentment is what remains. And then lastly, and the last stage, the most difficult stage of fana, is the annihilation of all otherness. The annihilation of everything that is between you and the one, no matter what it could possibly be. What the annihilation of all otherness means in practice is, of course, an extremely difficult issue which ultimately cannot be discussed in words. It's been described in images, in music, but it is the secret of secrets. And it's what remains then, the thing that remains when all otherness goes, is the one. That's all that remains. So that is how subsistence and annihilation and subsistence are images, mirror images of each other. When all otherness goes, then at that point the baqa is the one, and you basically subsist in the one. That is the highest gradient of all.
So you subsist in the one.
You subsist in the one, precisely. You subsist in the one because at that point you have this famous position when knower and known become one. There is the difference between subject and object is annihilated at that particular point. How and when that happens is the great secret. But it's what Plotinus writes about, what Ibn Arabi writes about. It's the heart of the matter.
Baqa is the result of fana.
Precisely. Something goes and something remains. That's actually very, very important, not to take fana on its own. There is fana so that something remains. You see, that's absolutely essential.
Can I ask a quick one?
Yes.
So I've heard this term annihilation in God.
Yeah.
So how is that different from subsistence in God?
It's the same thing. Annihilation. What does annihilation in God means? That annihilation of your subjective separate existence, annihilation of you being other than God. And that's that's the we'll come to Al-Halaj in a moment. We'll speak more about this in a moment, because we now come to the last of these four topics, which is love. Now I left love to the last because love is absolutely essential. Love is the energy that makes all this possible. Without love, there is no pathway. There is no movement. There's no energy to move in that direction where you want to go. It's the basis of everything. And this story of love, of course, has a long, long pedigree which goes back to the distant past. For Platonism, an absolutely key source is, of course, Plato's Symposion, and in particular the speech of Diotima. Socrates reports what Diotima, a woman, told him about love. And what she basically says is that love, in the end, is love of beauty and goodness in absolute perfection. And we have to realize that. And once we realize that, we are drawn away from everything secondary, from anything that is simply material, from anything that is purely physical. We are drawn into a direction where these things, beauty and goodness, exist in perfect simplicity and clarity. And ultimately, this is what we love. And even if we, for instance, love a jewel, or we love going on holiday, or we love anything, ultimately, the energy that loves in us is precisely the same energy that is awakened, because ultimately this is what we are aiming for. So for Diotima, all earthly love is simply an image of that ultimate love which takes us to this ultimate goal. And that's why love is the fundamental energy that makes this return of the soul possible. And it starts, as I said, with Plato already. And Plotinus develops this theme powerfully on his own. He says in the Ennead that I've given you, the soul in its nature loves God and longs to be at one with him. In complete simplicity, that is the heart of the matter. That's where everything is centered. That naturally, by nature, the soul, when it is polished, when it, so to say, it reveals its true essence, its real innate nature, then it cannot but love God. So long as it is there with him, it holds the heavenly love. Here, its love is baser. So Plotinus says earthly love is baser, is basically secondary. All earthly love is an image of that ultimate love. So, if you love your beloved, you are, in a sense, also divinizing your beloved. And I think everybody who has been really in love knows what I mean. So, when it comes to Arabic, again, the Quran is not a theoretical book. There is no theorizing about love. But there is a verse. God will bring a people he loves and who love him. Now, the Quran says God loves. Plotinus doesn't say that. For Plotinus, if the one were to love, it would mean that the one would be somehow insufficient. It would need something else. The one doesn't need anybody. That's why the one doesn't love. But the one simply just gives. And so the one arouses love for Plotinus. That's why all love is directed towards the one. But the one doesn't love. But in the Quran, there is a mutuality between God who loves and we who love. Now, what does this verse mean? Again, there has been an enormous amount of tafsir, of elucidation about the meaning of this particular verse. For the Shia, for instance, the people he loves and who love him are the Shiite Imams. Completely clear, they know what that means. But for the Sufis, very clear what that means. It basically means the Sufi tradition. So whatever you want to make of this verse is a sort of cornerstone of Sufi theology is not the right word, of Sufi thinking about life and man's relationship to God. And where this whole question of love becomes really important, again, in practice, is in this figure, Rabi'a al-Adawiyya. I think many of you will have heard of Rabi'a al-Adawiyya. She is a woman. She is generally identified as being the first paragon of divine love, the first poet who spoke about the notion that love ultimately is love of God. And in actual fact, very little reliable is known about Rabi'a al-Adawiyya's life. She became a legendary figure. There are many stories about her. She became a kind of a central legend, and the Islamic and Sufi lore about the meaning of love and man's relationship to God. And I wanted to mention this particular book, a new book about Rabi'a, From Narrative to Myth, written by Rkia Elaroui. The subtitle is The Many Faces of Islam's Most Famous Woman Saint, Rabi'a al-Adawiyya. And what she interestingly has done is to look into all the narratives about Rabi'a, and she found that there are similarities between this narrative and Plato's Symposium, and in particular the figure of Diotima in the Symposium and Rabi'a al-Adawiyya. In both cases we have a woman who is the ultimate mouthpiece of the meaning of love of God. And in this particular book she is arguing that while we do not have a translation of Plato's Symposium into Arabic, we have references to it, so the text was known. And she's basically arguing that there is a tradition which links this notion of divine love from the Symposium into the stories about Rabi'a al-Adawiyya and her significance. However, that may be, Rabi'a al-Adawiyya from the point of view of Arabic poetry is an extremely important figure, because it's from that moment onwards that all poetry about love in Arabic starts having two meanings. It's the real physical love for a real human being, and it's an image of the greater love for God. Arabic love poetry becomes ambiguous, becomes ambivalent, polyvalent is a better word for it. And this leads to a fantastic explosion, I should say, of poetry called ghazal, not only in Arabic, but in Persian, in Urdu, in Turkish, in other languages, where this particular polyvalent love poetry becomes fundamental to the literature and fundamental also to the music. It's set to music in numerous ways. And throughout, there is always this feeling that anything earthly is really but a mirror of something heavenly. And this duality of the two together, where by the one, where the other is always there as an echo of the other, gives this tradition an extraordinary richness. Some examples of it in Arabic, we come to Al-Hallaj. Yeah. Al-Hallaj, you may have heard of him, is a major mystic poet who was brutally executed. Some people say because he pretended that he had achieved unification with God, which was seen as, of course, outrageous. And one of his poems, he says in one of his poems, love is primordial eternity, eternally. In him, by him, from him, it begins in him. Love is not temporal, since it was an attribute of the one whose martyrs are alive. This poem, in this poem, he expresses in a totally clear-cut way that love begins from God. From a Platonian way, if you look at it from Plotinus' perspective, you would say love begins from God because it is God that we love. From a Quranic perspective, you would say God also loves. But whichever way you look at it, love is eternal because it's divine. It's absolutely fundamental. And that is why it is the power that has the capacity to draw us up into that supreme condition. And I'll give you two verses by Ibn Arabi which are extremely famous. I profess the creed of love, wherever its caravans their faces turn. For love is my doctrine and my faith. The creed of love, Din al-Hub. Love becomes, in actual fact, a religion in the real sense of the word, because it is the central emotion that in fact makes that journey to the ultimate possible. And then he says, we have exemplars in Hind of Bishr and her sister Qais and Layla, and May and Ghaylan. Now who are they? Qais and Layla, May and Ghaylan, these were lovers, old Arabian lovers from olden times, centuries ago, who probably knew nothing about Sufism or about Neoplatonism. They were just legendary lovers. The reason why Ibn Arabi mentions them is because in the story of every lover, ultimately the love for the one is present. The reason why love exists in the first place is because of this. And these pairs are famous lovers, Qais and Layla in particular. Qais and Layla, as you know, I'm sure you know the story, they were in love, they were separated. Qais could not marry Layla. Qais went into the desert and ultimately died out of love. So these are the exemplars according to Ibn Arabi. So I just wanted to point out that these thoughts led me to a project which resulted in a book that was published this year, whereby the interaction between Neoplatonism and poetry was studied not only in Arabic, but also in Arabic, in Persian, in Turkish, in Hebrew, and in Spanish, Italian, and in Greek. And this book is accompanied by a website, there it is, called Lyrics of Ascent, Poetry in the Platonic Tradition. And that website is accessible, freely accessible to anybody. And it includes a very large number of poems in that tradition, including the Arabic poems that I just mentioned, the one by Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, by al-Halaj, and by Ibn Arabi. They are all on that website. So that is part of this whole story. But this brings me just in time to my concluding remarks. We started out talking about Neoplatonism and the Islamic tradition. You saw what take I took with the Islamic tradition. I took the Quran, I took to some extent philosophy and theology, but also I involved poetry and the arts. Neoplatonism, Islamic tradition was receptive to Neoplatonism, and the point is it was receptive because of certain fundamental similarities between the Neoplatonic philosophy and the Quran. That's where it begins. Without that, you wouldn't have had this degree of conjunction. And the similarities are, first of all, Tawheed, the unity, the notion of unity and oneness. The notion of the one being utterly transcendent on the one hand and totally immanent on the other, manifest in the signs of creation. Also the contrast between that spiritual world of the hereafter and the inferior, transitory nature of ordinary life, or ordinary material reality, another similarity. And then, of course, most importantly, the question of the trajectory of the soul. We came from there and we go back from there. That fundamental structural similarity made it possible for the Islamic tradition to turn to this Neoplatonic heritage and make something totally new out of it. And that is the interesting thing. I would call it a transformative change that Islamic tradition brought to this past. And this took, I call it transformative engagement. It took different steps, or had different steps. The first one is, I call it here, Quranic hermeneutics. The fact of reading the Quranic message itself from the perspective of this philosophical heritage. I gave you several examples of it. Another one that I could give, which is very important, I've talked to you about the Platonian notion of the universal intellect and the universal soul. The Quran doesn't mention those concepts, but the Quran speaks about, in its imageries, it speaks about the heavenly pen and the heavenly tablet. For those interpreters, the heavenly pen was clearly the universal intellect, and the heavenly tablet on which all of existence is, so to say, preordained, is nothing other than the universal soul. So the Quran was found to be full of hints at that philosophical heritage, which then went well beyond the structural similarities that I just explained. Then, when it comes to transformative engagement, it took two different aspects. On the one hand, a theoretical and a practical one. The theoretical one, I would call it extensive investigation and elaboration of concepts in philosophy, Shia and Sunni, and in Sufi theosophy. If you look at simply how the concept of unification with the one of fana, the sophistication with which the Arabic tradition analyzes this is extraordinary. The same thing, purification, if you look at Muhasibi, the way Muhasibi speaks about self-examination for the purposes of purification, it's stunning. It's a completely new start. It's an old tradition which is transformed utterly and brought into a new level altogether. It's like a kind of quantum jump that Islam brought to this tradition. And when it comes to practice, similar. In practice, Islam transforms Neoplatonic principles into, I say, artistic and devotional practice. You see, I gave the example in visual art. I spoke about the way geometry operates in calligraphy and in visual arts. You could see how for the Neoplatonists, for Plotinus, geometry is a sign. I've explained why it is a sign. What the Islamic tradition did is it took that sign and said, well, let's go ahead and work with it. Let's make something out of it. And they made a fantastic artistic tradition out of this particular purely theoretical concept. They brought it into a totally different level of existence. And the same thing with verbal art, with poetry. That fantastic Ghazal poetry tradition, where the binary nature of existence, the heavenly and the earthly, become a melody that suffuses everything. In a tradition, in a poetic tradition that went on for centuries. This is another example of this complete kind of new beginning that the Islamic tradition brought to this past. And my last example is of a concrete, transforming principles into devotional practice is the dance of the whirling of Rumi. Remember that we read earlier by Plotinus this particular statement. It's number 4.2. Every soul that knows its history is aware that its movement unthwarted is not that of an outgoing line. Its natural course may be linked to that in which a circle turns upon some external, but it's not upon some external, but on its own center, the point to which it owes its rise. And this is exactly what that particular dance of Rumi holds. We have a movement from ontological expression to spiritual enactment. Plotinus says the soul is a noble thing, like a circle fitting itself around its center. And then even in the Ennead that I gave you, Plotinus says, we dance our God-inspired dance around Him who is present in us. And this is what happens in that example. So you can see how a tradition moves from theory into practical enactment and thereby is totally transformed into something new and immensely enriching. And that is what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.